We are going to be going through the Gospel of Mark for the next little bit. And I'm going to try something a little bit different and see how that works out. But it's 16 chapters long, so we will be taking some breaks. Don't worry, we'll be taking some breaks. But we're going to be going through the Gospel of Mark. Now, there's 4 Gospels. The Gospels are all stories about Jesus. They're not biographies as such, but they're all written with a specific purpose. Matthew writes his gospel, and he writes his gospel to Jews. And their purpose of that gospel and everything he includes, the way that he talks about Jesus, the purpose of that is to tell them that Jesus is the fulfillment of all the prophecies about the Messiah, that he is the coming king. That's why he writes that. Luke writes it because he's gotten tired of all these other people writing things, and he wasn't actually there. So a guy named Theophilus actually is his patron to go and collect all these firsthand accounts and to put them in one chronological story. The others are not chronological, but Luke's like, I want to get this done right. John was actually with Jesus. John the apostle was there with Jesus, the one that Jesus loved. And he writes his account, and he writes his account very last. And he writes it for a specific purpose, to tell people that Jesus was a man, because there's a whole lot of disagreement about that Jesus was God. And then whenever Mark writes, Mark is different. Mark writes because he wants to portray Jesus as a servant. The reason he does that is because he's writing to the Romans. And the Romans are very familiar with the concept of a God being with people. But when their gods were with people, it was to take advantage of them. It was to abuse them. It was to indulge their own desires. And so the way that he portrays this is a familiar thing to them, that Jesus is God and that he was with man. But he doesn't behave like their gods did. Instead, he behaves as a servant. He also reflects this idea about that Jesus is God, but there is a creator God that is both part of him and separate from him, which is an answer to a question that the Romans have been asking, the Greeks and Romans both, because you read Greek and Roman mythology, and there's all these things about, this God of this river, and this God who does this, but it's pretty ambiguous who made everything. And there's some, I can get super nerdy with this and talk to you about the demiurges and things like that. But they never really nailed down who made everything. They were more interested in the day-to-day. But they acknowledged that there was a creator, and no one was sure who that was. And when John writes this, he says, you understand the concept of God coming to be with man, but it's different than what you're used to, because he gives himself up, whereas your gods would take advantage of you. But he's not just there for himself, but he comes from the creator, the one that you've been looking for, the one that you've been trying to answer questions about who this is. And that's how he writes. And the thing that I really like about Mark, besides the fact that it's short, is it's different than all the rest of them. Because he's writing to Romans who are not interested in prophecy. He's writing to Romans who are not interested in philosophy. He's writing to Romans who are interested in results. And I feel like this is a pretty easy thing to identify with as an American. Like, I'm not interested in what you have to say. I'm interested in what you have to do. Not everybody feels that way, and you can tell by the election, some people just care about what you have to say. But I'm interested in results, and that was a joke. I'm interested in results, and I want to know what happened. And when Mark writes, he says, all right, I'm not going to waste a bunch of time talking to you about prophecy that you don't know about because you're not Jews. Instead, I'm going to talk to you about what Jesus did and who he was. And we look at the other gospel writers. Matthew was called by Jesus to spend time with him. Matthew was a tax collector and called with him. Luke showed up later on Paul's journeys. He was a later convert. He never met Jesus. He wasn't there. It's all firsthand accounts. John was called there on the Sea of Galilee. He was called to follow Jesus. But Mark, where does Mark come from? Now that I think about it, at this point in my life, I would have Sunday school teachers would say, who are the apostles? And you can spout off Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, trying to get them there. And it turns out that's not right. That's about half right. Mark, who is Mark? Who is this guy that shows up and writes this story? And I've talked about Mark before, but I just really, before we get into this, I want to introduce you to who Mark is. Now, Mark is a guy that's kind of in the background. He pops up at different times, but he's kind of in the background. The first place that I think we see Mark, it's not real clear who it is, but the first place that I see Mark, he is the member of the first youth group. He's the teenager and he's there. And it's a serious moment where he acts like a member of the youth group in the middle of a serious moment. In Mark chapter 14, verse 51, this is the only gospel that includes this story, which is one of the reasons that we think this is Mark. In Mark chapter 14, verse 51, it says, "A young man followed him with nothing but a linen cloth around his body, and they seized him, but he left the linen cloth and ran away naked." And that's the first youth group. There's the arrest of Jesus. A teenage boy ends up doing something that embarrasses everybody. That's John Mark. We think this is him because he leaves this is his signature on it and what he says to say here, but also because of some other stuff that's going to come up later that I'll tell you about in just a minute. So what we think has happened here is that we know that Jesus went to the house of someone to have Passover, but we don't know who it was. But he went to this house, and it was a wealthy person's house because they had servants and they had an extra room. And they go up to this, and while they're there, they leave and they go to the garden. Now, in a minute, we're going to find out that there was a woman named Mary, and she had a son named John Mark. And she had a large house with extra space and servants and a teenage son, and the church would meet in her house. And so this is one of the reasons that we think this is him. And what we think is going on here is that the soldiers go to arrest Jesus. Judas leads them to the first place that he knows that they were, which was back at the house. He takes them there, and when he gets there, Jesus isn't there. So they leave. John Mark, teenage boy, has been sent to bed, and he's upstairs because it's hot, and he sleeps up higher. Maybe he's up on the roof. And he's sleeping there, and he sees the soldiers coming, and he wants to know what's going on. So he wraps himself up in a sheet because soft cotton underwear are not really a thing that everybody has, so he's sleeping to stay cool. He wraps himself up in a sheet, and he follows the soldiers to the garden, and when he gets there, he sees them arrest Jesus, and they see this kid, and they grab him with him. And they grab his sheet, and he leaves without the sheet. And that's where we see John for the first time, or Mark for the first time. Mark is there in the background. He's a teenager growing up around Jesus, growing up around the apostles. We see him again later on and it's really only tangentially that we see him. It's related to Mary. They say they were there gathered together, and they were waiting on Peter. They were praying together because Peter had been arrested, and they were all gathered together in the house of Mary, whose son was John Mark. And they're gathered together there, and they're waiting and praying, hoping that Peter will be released from prison. And that's the only mention that we have of him there. Now, you say, well, I thought his name was Mark. Why is his name John Mark? Well, lots of people had two names. They had a Roman name and they had a Hebrew name. John is his Hebrew name, and Mark is his Roman name. And you say, well, that's kind of weird. Well, you know about other people that have it. Paul has another name, that's Saul, right? His Hebrew name was Saul, and his Roman name was Paul, and that's what they called him by. So he's got this name, and John Mark is referred to throughout Scripture of somebody that keeps popping up. We see, I think, his signature there in Mark. We see him at his mom's house while the church is all gathered together, right? The church is all gathered together at his house. They're having a prayer meeting, and the only reason we know he's there is because he gets important later, and they just happen to mention that it's his house that they're at. But then he shows up again in Acts chapter 12, and we see him really do something for the first time. Acts chapter 12, verse 25. Barnabas and Saul returned from Jerusalem when they completed their service, bringing with them John, whose other name was Mark. Now, why did they take him with them? Well, see, Barnabas and Saul, whose other name was Paul, they're not missionaries yet. In fact, Paul has been kind of out of the way in Tarsus for a long time. But he's just been brought back in because Barnabas said, we need a strong, good teacher. We need another pastor at this church. And he goes to get Paul and brings him back. And Paul is reintroduced to the church and what's going on. They go down to Jerusalem to do some business. And while they're there, they grab this kid named John Mark, and they take him back with them as they're going on. They're not going out as missionaries yet. They're just taking him with them. Why would they do that? We're going to read later that Barnabas is actually John Mark's uncle. We keep seeing these connections over and over that he keeps showing up in this story. Now, your Bible might say that he's cousins with him. And the thing is, it's an ambiguous term, so we don't know. But it doesn't really matter if he's uncle or cousin, but they act as uncle and nephew. Barnabas takes John Mark under his wing. We know that there's a man present whenever Jesus goes to the household, but after Jesus goes to that household, it's not mentioned anymore. And what it seems like is that John Mark's dad has died. This is a guess. But Barnabas comes along and he takes this young man under his wing because we've got a kid that grew up in the youth group. He was around Jesus. He wasn't a part of what was going on, but he was a kid that grew up in this. And now they're like, all right, you're a man now. We're going to take you out into the world. Uncle Barney's going to take you under his wing, and we are going to help you establish your manhood here. We're going to take you out and let you do something. So they take him away from mom's house, and they go back to Antioch. Barnabas and Saul took him with him. And in Acts chapter 13, what we find out is that, it's actually Acts chapter 12 and then into 13, what we find out is that God, when they get back, God calls Paul and Barnabas to be missionaries. And they're going to go. Now, John Mark wasn't setting out to be a missionary. In fact, there's no such thing as a missionary until this point. Nobody had ever done this. The only reason they had spread to different places was because people tried to kill them and they had to run away. And that's how you become an accidental missionary. But God says, set aside for me Paul and Barnabas. Now, we see Paul and Barnabas, and that's what we talk about. But who's going to go with them? John Mark. John Mark goes with them. And he goes on this journey. And again, I just want to emphasize this to you. We've got the youth group kid who's right on the edge between being a teenager and being an adult. His biggest claim to fame was he lost his clothes at the arrest of Jesus, and his mom is important. And now he's on the first missionary journey. They sail out from there and they go over to Cyprus, and it's their first stop. And they work across the island of Cyprus. In Acts chapter 13, verse 13, they finish up, they get to the north end of Cyprus, and they're going to sail away. And Paul and his companions set sail from Paphos and came to Perga in Pamphylia. And John left them and returned to Jerusalem. So we got a kid who got the opportunity, not of a lifetime, but the opportunity of history to be on the first missionary journey. And he sets off and he's pumped because he's going to get to go spend time with this. He's going to be super. You remember how that felt being a teenager and you're ready for your life to start, and now something exciting's happening and you're super important because you get to be there too. And you go off for your first time and you're sailing there. And then he gets to Cyprus and he finds out what a lot of youth pastors find out, a lot of new preachers find out, is that ministry is work. They thought it was preaching and having people shake your hand and telling you good job. But it turns out there's a lot of work between Sunday and Sunday. And John Mark goes with them and they travel across and they have some difficult dealings there in Cyprus. And when they get to the north end of Cyprus, John Mark says, I'm out. I'm leaving. I'm going to go back to mom's house. Because I thought it was pretty confining there, but this is pretty hard work. We don't get a lot of details on why we left. And you might say, well, maybe he just got tired. Maybe mom told him to be home after a certain amount of time. But in Acts chapter 15, he shows up again. Paul and Barnabas have come back home. They finished their ministry journey. They come back home. And there they decide they're going to go back and they're going to visit the churches that they've been to and go on another journey. And Barnabas says, hey, I want to take John Mark with us. Barnabas wanted to take with them John called Mark. But Paul thought best not to take with them one who had withdrawn from them in Pamphylia and had not gone with them to the work. Uncle Barney says, I want to take John Mark with us. He's sorry about leaving us. And this is the first place where we get the idea that there was a reason that he left. It wasn't a great reason. Paul has a very low opinion of him. And Uncle Barney says, he's a kid. Let's give him a chance. He's sorry. He wants to try again. And Paul says, no. We're not playing games out here. This is serious business. Jesus is coming back. We don't have time for people who lose their clothes and quit on the first mission trip. We don't have time for people like that. We need serious people who will dedicate themselves seriously to this. And he said, no, I'm not taking him with me. But there arose a sharp disagreement in verse 39. So that they separated from each other, and Barnabas took Mark with him and sailed away to Cyprus. So John Mark's 3 claims to fame: embarrassing Jesus while he's being arrested, bailing on the first mission trip a week in, and breaking up the first missionary team. Now, If you were to predict the future of this kid, where do you see it going? You predict the future of this kid and say, how is he going to play into the work of this new movement of Christianity? How is he going to, he ain't going to go be anywhere important, because we're going to keep this kid far, far away from where important things happen. Because everywhere he goes, he just messes everything up. And Paul, the Apostle Paul, who we look to say what's right and wrong, we look to say what God has to say, says, no, I'm not taking this kid with me. And you look at this and you're like, who's right here? Well, generally I lean toward Paul being right. But Barnabas says, no, I'm taking him with me. I'm taking him with me. And they split. Paul begins to work with a guy named Silas. And Barnabas works with John Mark. And Barnabas doesn't show up in the story again. He moves himself out of the center spotlight of Christianity for the sake of his nephew cousin, and is moved off to the side. And they go separate directions. Paul chose Silas and departed, having been commended by the brothers to the grace of the Lord. So you predict from this point what happens to John Mark. You're like, well, this guy, he gets pushed to the back. He's in charge of counting chairs at church. He's not in charge of anything important, nothing he can mess up. There was actually a guy I know one time that he really wanted to help with something, and the church was like, I don't know that we can trust him because he'd made a lot of mistakes. And they put him in charge of counting every chair in the building. That was his job, counting the chairs. And that's where you put John Mark, right? Because you can't trust this guy. He's just going to mess it up. But we know, because we're reading a gospel written by him, that something must go differently. It seems like after these 3 huge blunders that John Mark has a change of heart. He's embarrassed, has a change of heart, and he wants to go on because he shows up again. Barnabas takes him to Cyprus and teaches him to do ministry and gives him a chance to fail, gives him opportunities to fail, gives him opportunities to make mistakes, allows him to be a teenager who is growing and changing and learning. But then the next time we see John Mark is in 1 Peter chapter 5. Peter, the Apostle Peter, the guy who always had something to say that was with Jesus, this is what Peter says. 1 Peter chapter 5. By Silvanus, a faithful brother as I regard him, I have written to you briefly. He says, I'm writing this letter, Silvanus is copying it down for me, exhorting and declaring that this is true. This is the true grace of God. Stand firm in it. She who is at Babylon, who is likewise chosen, sends you greetings. That's a different conversation. And then he says this at the end of this letter that Peter writes to be distributed to all the churches in Turkey and over into Europe. She who is at Babylon, who is my likewise chosen, sends you greetings, and so does Mark, my son. John Mark has gone from being the failure, the guy that you can't trust, the embarrassment to Jesus, the embarrassment to his mom, the embarrassment to his uncle, the guy that Paul won't work with, to being someone that Peter says, my son, John Mark. You say, well, that's Peter. Paul writes about him too in 2 Timothy chapter 4. Paul is arrested and he's alone. He's been in jail for a while, and he writes this letter to his son in the faith, Timothy. He says, do your best to come to me soon. For Demas, in love with this present world, has deserted me and gone to Thessalonica. So one of the companions that he had said, I got a chance to make some money and not be miserable. I'm out. Crescens has gone to Galatia, Titus to Dalmatia. These are guys that have gone off to work in specific churches. They haven't abandoned him, but they've gone to go work. And now Paul is alone with Luke. Luke is alone with me. And this is what he says, get Mark and bring him with you, for he is very useful to me for ministry. He says, I'm alone. Who do I want when I'm alone? The kid who lost his clothes at the arrest of Jesus. The kid who bailed on the first mission trip. The kid who broke up the first missionary team. The kid that nobody wants. I need him. I'm alone. And if I can have one person, I want John Mark with me because he is very useful to me for ministry. Paul writes to the church at Colossae in Colossians chapter 4. Aristarchus, my fellow prisoner, greets you. And Mark, the cousin of Barnabas, concerning whom you've received instructions. If he comes to you, welcome him. What does this tell us? That Paul doesn't just like John Mark. doesn't just trust John Mark, but he has told the other churches that he is over, the other churches he started, is when John Mark speaks, pretend it's me speaking, because I trust him and I can't come to you, so I send him to you. You have instructions concerning him, and you're to listen to him, because when he speaks, consider it the same as me speaking. If he comes to you, welcome him. What do we learn? We learn that John Mark didn't quit again. He quit the first time, but when given a second opportunity, he continued for the rest of his life. We learned that he became competent and great at ministry. And we learned that Paul trusted him with his authority. And he didn't just trust him, but the kid who was the laughingstock in Jerusalem, the churches, when they spread out all over the world, they would tell this story about this kid in the first youth group, and you would not believe what that kid did, is now being spoken to by the churches across Asia and into Europe. And every one of them have standing instructions that when this kid shows up, you listen. How did that happen? How do we go from a kid who embarrasses Jesus at his arrest, a kid who bails on the first mission trip, a kid who breaks up the first mission team, to being someone with the authority to walk into any church and speak and be listened to, and you assume that he's right, and if you disagree with him, you're wrong? How does that happen? How do we go from that to him writing probably the first gospel that was written? How do we go from that? This is not in the Bible. This happens afterwards. This is tradition. He goes into Africa and is the first missionary in Africa and starts churches all over the north of Africa and eventually settles in Alexandria, where he is martyred. How do we go from that kid to a guy who pens probably the first gospel, who has authority over all the churches, who is a missionary in Africa, and who is martyred for his faith? How do we go for that? How do we go from those two places? Because if we were all to look at what he did and say, what's going to happen? And we would say, nothing. He's going to be quiet. He's going to be in the background. He's going to tithe and he's going to be quiet. That's it. How do we go from this kid who messes up everything he touches to this respected leader? What happens? What happens is in Acts chapter 15, verse 37. Barnabas wanted to take with them John called Mark. But Paul thought best not to take with them one who had withdrawn from them in Pamphylia and had not gone with them to the work. What happened is one person believed in John Mark and gave him another opportunity. One person said he's a kid and he has an opportunity. He should have the opportunity to grow and do better. Other people, the Apostle Paul said, no, there is no room for mistakes. There's no room for change. There's no room for deviation. There is only room for serious ministry by people that we can trust. The rest of the church wanted to agree with him because he's Paul. But one guy says no. He deserves another opportunity. It wasn't the call of God, because the call of God led him to do all these things, but if it wasn't for Barnabas, the call of God wouldn't have gotten him to do anything because nobody would have listened. It wasn't his faith and rededicating himself in his faith and deciding that he's going to give it another go, because you can decide you're going to give it another go and not get any opportunities. But it was because someone in the church said, look, just because he messed up doesn't mean that we're done with him. Just because he failed the first time and the second time and the third time doesn't mean that he's out. But someone in the church said, you know what? I want to take him again. And because of that, we have these words in Mark chapter 1, verse 1, the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. And who wrote those words? The kid that couldn't be trusted. The kid that messed everything up. The kid that bailed. And the only reason he was able to write those words is because someone in the church said, let's give him another chance. Barnabas took Mark with him. knowing what he had done, knowing what might happen again, knowing how it would go. Barnabas took Mark with him, and because of that, we have the words that we'll be studying for the next weeks and months. Guys, churches can get really geared in on us because this is for us. The preaching is for us. And by us, I mean the adults in the room that show up regularly, right? We give the money, we pay the bills, we do the work. This is for us. And there are kids here, but we really would prefer the kids to be quiet and stay out of the way because this is for us. And if the kids disturb us, then they're disturbing what this is about. So go teach the kids some Bible stories. I know it's a burden that nobody wants, but we'll take turns. Go teach the kids some Bible stories and keep them out of the way because this is about us. Like, well, there's teens here, and somebody really needs to teach them not to sleep with anybody before they're married. So we'll do that. But otherwise, I want them to keep out of the way and not make too much of a mess. Please don't break anything. Because this is for us and about us. Have new people come in, and maybe those new people are not as spiritually mature. Maybe they got some things to learn. Maybe they like to do things a little bit differently than we like to do them, and they come in and they mess up our stuff and our way of doing things. And we say, man, I'm glad they're here, but I really wish they wouldn't mess up what we're trying to do here. Because this is about us. And that's a common problem. I'm not throwing rocks at anybody. The Apostle Paul had this problem. But when Barnabas said, you know what, this isn't just about me. I need to hear the Word of God. I need to serve God. I need to grow. But it's not just about me. It's not just about how I want it. It's not just about what is convenient for me and making this happen. But this is for all of us. That we are actually gathered here for the purpose of reaching those kids. We're gathered here for the purpose of growing those teens. We're here for the purpose of bringing in those new people. And that's going to mean that sometimes our sandbox gets messed up a little bit. Our toys get broken a little bit. The way that we want things done doesn't always go exactly the way that we want it. Sometimes we have disturbances. Sometimes the kids make messes, but that's part of reaching those people. That's when John marks arise. I'm like Henry and Eleanor and my kids. My mom had me at church that first week after I was born. She was a piano player and she taught Sunday school. My dad was hard to believe it at the time. He was a song leader at the time, and they were in church and they were working and they were doing all this stuff. And we were there 3, 4, 5 times a week because we'd have Sunday morning, Sunday night, and it was 2 hours both times, and we would be there on Wednesday. And the thing is, I have not always been the paragon of wisdom and virtue that you see before you now. So you can tell that's a joke. But I was a dumb little kid that broke things and made messes. Was loud. And then I was a teenager, and I was a kid mostly at Union Hill Missionary Baptist Church. And then I was a teenager at Pleasant Valley Missionary Baptist Church. And there were a lot of people there. Said, these kids are too loud, and these kids are causing problems. And we did. And we were. I worked at Bud Creek Camp. That's where I worked. And I remember I got my first job there when I was 13, and I thought I was something. And I remember one time I ran in and I had a ketchup bottle full of water, and we would recycle the ketchup bottles. That's a whole different story. But we had a ketchup bottle full of water, and I was chasing somebody. I was going to squirt them with this bottle, and I ran in the door. They ran in the cafeteria, and I ran in right behind them into a business meeting with a ketchup bottle full of water. And I surrendered to ministry at 15. I felt the call of God in my life to preach at 15, and I started doing that. And I thought that because I'd been called to preach, I had something to say. I was wrong. I had nothing to say. I had lots of things to say, but nothing worthwhile. And I went to seminary, and I went to seminary at 17. And all of these places, there were definitely Apostle Pauls who said, they're too loud and they're causing problems and running into the business meeting with a ketchup bottle full of water. I'd been in ministry I'd been on staff at a church for about a year and a half, 2 years. And I saw the president of the seminary that I graduated from. And I said, hey, how's it going? And he said, great. He said, it's great to hear that you're still up there and still working. We were all talking about it, and we didn't think you'd make it a year. That's so awesome that you would tell me that. There were a lot of people that were the Apostle Paul that said, you know what, this kid is too loud, and he's a problem, and he's an arrogant little punk. But there were a few Barnabases that realized that what that church was doing, what those churches were doing, what that camp was doing, what that seminary was for, was to take people who ran their mouths and who were too loud and who didn't know the right things to say, and to love them and to teach them and to help grow them to the point that they could be servants of God. And it was only because of them that I stand before you and give you the opportunity to put up with my immaturity and my lack of wisdom and all of my faults. But if it were not for them, I would not be here. If it were not for Barnabas, John Mark would not be writing this gospel for us to read and for people for 2,000 years to have studied and learned about Jesus and come to faith from. And there are kids out there right now. I can hear them. I can hear them. And there are teenagers. And there are new people. And there are people on the outside that Jesus is calling us to reach. And if we turn our eyes in on ourselves and say, this is for me. This is about me. And I can't learn and I can't grow with those kids doing that. And I can't handle when these teenagers do that. And I like having new people come in. If they come in and they're just like us and they do the same things that we do, the way that we want them to do, that's great. But if it disturbs me, then we're disturbing the purpose of what this is for. We can behave that way, and if we behave that way, then we'll grow spiritually. And we'll have our toys arranged the way that we want them, and we'll have everything exactly the way that we like it. But if instead we will decide, I'm not just here for me in the way that I want things, but rather I am here because there are people that need to know Jesus. There are people that far from God that need to be reached. There are people that Jesus wants to bring into that church. And reaching kids means that sometimes it's going to be loud. And that does not disturb what we're trying to do, but is part of what we're trying to do. That reaching teenagers means that sometimes a kid is going to end up with an inappropriate amount of clothes at the arrest of Jesus. But that's part of reaching teenagers. That's part of what you're going to have to deal with. And that reaching new people, reaching lost people, reaching people that do things differently than we do, means that things change. And it's not a side effect of it. It's not a problem that comes along with it. It's not a thing to overcome, but it's a part of what we're called to do. And when churches will do that, we get John Marks. And until they get to the point that they're John Mark, who's writing the Gospels and preaching in churches and has authority, we're going to deal with some weird stuff. But if we will endure, then those kids out there, man, what are they going to be? Those teens, most of whom are out there actually teaching the kids right now, what are they going to be? Those people who are far from God, that Jesus has called us to bring near to Him, what are they going to be? And the people that Jesus brings into our church that maybe stir things up and maybe things change and they're not the way that we've always liked them being, but Jesus brought them in because we needed to change, what are they going to turn us into? Guys, you and I have both seen churches that have everything exactly the way that they want it. And it's quiet and nothing is broken. And they sit together and they watch themselves shrink. Because when you decide that everything is about you, then why would anybody else be a part of it? But there are churches that decide, you know what, it's not just about us, but our job is to reach them. And they put up with the noise, and they put up with the mess, and they put up with change. And you know what happens to them? They get to sit back 18, 20, 25 years later and say, can you believe that John Mark wrote this gospel? I remember when that kid came back from the arrest of Jesus and his mama whooped him from the front yard to his bedroom. I remember that. I was there. Can you believe? And that will be us. We're going to study through the book of Mark for a few weeks. But I never want us to lose sight of the fact that this book was not written by the kid who had everything right from the time that he was born and did everything perfectly and was well behaved and was leading devotionals at 12 and went all the way through and was the perfect kid. But this was written by the kid that other people didn't want around, that the Apostle Paul said, I don't want him with me. But he was written because Uncle Barney said, let's give him one more chance. If we will say, you know what, God, I'm willing to give people one more chance, and another chance after that, and another chance after that, and another chance after that, what will God do in our kids? What will God do in our teens? What will God do in our church? If we say, you know what, it's not just about us, and making it about them means that I'm going to have to deal with some stuff, and I'm okay with that. What would happen? Our Heavenly Father, we come before you right now, and I thank you so much for the opportunity you've given us to gather together in worship. I ask that you would help us, Lord, to remember what we were like as kids, what we were like as teenagers, what we were like as immature 20-somethings, Lord, and that we would give grace upon grace. That we would remember that we are not just here to have things the way that we want them and just so that it's focused on what we want to do and how we want to do it, but we are here to reach those other people. And that means there will be messes, and that means there will be noise, and that means there will be broken things, but that is not something that we should avoid, but part of what we're trying to do here, Lord. I ask that you would send us people that you love enough, that you want somebody to deal with what it takes to raise them, that you want somebody to deal with what it takes to take them from being John Mark as a teenager to John Mark who was writing the Gospel of Mark. I ask that you would trust us with that and send us those people. But I ask that you would soften our hearts towards the people we have now. That we would be okay with things not being exactly the way that we want them all the time. But we would recognize that sometimes reaching other people means that our stuff's going to get moved. And Lord, I ask that you would take our children that are here now, that these teens that are here now, the people that are in this room right now, Lord, and that you would raise up John Marks, that in 5 years or 10 years or 15 years, Lord, that we would look back and say, can you remember when that person did? But look at them now. And that as Barnabas said, let us continue to give John Mark another chance, we would say the same thing and see the same results. Lord, I ask it in Jesus' name.